Are you ready? Okay. Everybody ready? Good to go? Inherent harms. Nuclear hostility is the highest it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. China and Russia are threatening nuclear war and no restraints are on the horizon. This is from Hirsch in 2023. There's little hope for restraining the threat of nuclear war in the foreseeable future. No meaningful U.S. communication with either Russia or China. The U.S. continues to push for military dominance over both Russia and China, bringing nuclear brinkmanship back into the conversation about the war equation. Political pressure suggests a long-term arms race. The United States will need to deter two near-peer nuclear powers for the first time in its history. We have a level of hostility that is the worst since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thus, the plan. The United States federal government should substantially reduce the role of its nuclear weapons by declaring a no first use policy. The solvency. A no first use policy is essential to increase global focus on climate change, non-proliferation, and reestablish congressional checks on sole authority for nuclear use. A formal declaration is a first step to nuclear disarmament and opening lines of diplomacy. This is by Weiss in 2023. Increased nuclear danger undermines the global efforts to combat climate change. We could be done unilaterally is to guarantee a no first use policy. Urgently needed treaties, mutual assurances, and technical mechanisms for nuclear non-proliferation disarmament have eroded. No first use policies are important steps towards nuclear disarmament. To make progress possible, nuclear powers have to have diplomacy. U.S. nuclear policies are sheer madness and must be completely reconsidered. Current U.S. policy does not restrict the president's ability to order a nuclear strike for any reason. Adopting an NFU policy would reaffirm Congress's constitutional authority to declare war. The advantage on brinkmanship starts with nuclear brinkmanship is on the rise. Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran all risk nuclear breakout as long as the United States continues to threaten first use. This is from Hirsch in 2023. Putin is responsible for nuclear threat with the escalate to de-escalate policy, threatening nuclear war to prevent conflicts from getting worse. Major powers are slipping into a new era of nuclear brinkmanship. Both the United States and China said nuclear weapons should be off the table, and their actions speak differently. China continues to escalate. U.S. strategy is in the Indo-Pacific relies on belief that U.S. nuclear arsenal would deter escalation in the region. In the event of a military conflict over Taiwan, Beijing might detonate a nuclear weapon off the coast of Hawaii as a warning. Biden continues to push Putin against a wall, breaching red line by escalating arms aid to Ukraine. Putin and the Kremlin are never going to acknowledge strategic failure. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring in an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or nuclear war. Adding to the tension is the new seeming willingness of North Korea to use its nukes preemptively, and Iran's inching closer and closer to nuclear breakout, with Russia now encouraging it. That could encourage more proliferation, especially in Saudi Arabia. And NFU is the only risk to ensure peace and reduce the risk of nuclear miscalculation and proliferation. This spills over and establishes an international norm for nuclear security. This is by Graham in 2021. No use of nuclear weapons could remain limited. Even restrained use would be enormously destructive to life and property. The advantage of a policy of no first use, beginning with the United States, would reduce the chances of nuclear weapon miscalculation and help establish an international norm of behavior against first use. Declaring a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons would be a significant step towards peace and stability. Nuclear disarmament remains a long way off. Even small reductions are unlikely, but a policy of no first use is important to peace, security, disarmament, and non-proliferation can be adopted now. There's a impact scenario here and another one later. This is impact scenario 1, Russia. Ambiguity risks Russian nuclear miscalculation. This is by Cornier and Messmer in 2022. There would be major risks for Russia if it were to detonate even a low-yield nuclear weapon in the Ukraine. The ambiguity of threats also makes it more difficult to determine what level of engagement in the conflict would lead to nuclear use. The risk they may be used remains high. Ambiguity often leads to misunderstandings, miscalculation, and catastrophic missteps. These risks affect everyone, and even a small-scale nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia would be civilization ending. This is by Axe in 2019. An exchange of small-yield tactical nuclear weapons between the U.S. and Russia would be catastrophic. Even civilization ending. The risk of nuclear war has increased dramatically in the past 2 years, and the United States and Russia have abandoned longstanding nuclear arms control treaties, started to develop new kinds of nuclear weapons, and expanded the circumstances in which they might use nuclear weapons. Impact 2 is China. The United States' adoption of no first use is key to starting arms control discussions with China. This is by Banafshae in 2023. China has consistently said it would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. Such discussions should start between arms control specialists on both sides. There have been no reports that no first use policy was discussed. Historically, it has been the U.S. who has opposed no first use. However, the U.S. changed its position in the defense of Taiwan. The U.S. policy was so-called strategic ambiguity, intentionally unclear whether it would respond to militarily to an attack on Taiwan. The U.S. adoption of no first use pledge would give legitimacy to encourage and badger China if necessary, do the same. The point being that new urgency matches efforts to engage in arms control discussions, and arms control is the only way to pull us back from the brink of nuclear war. Oren Lloyd M. Jonovic, 2021. The U.S. and Chinese governments would be focused on increasing communication, cooperation, trust in order to address growing tensions. Instead, Washington and Beijing throw money at inflating and modernizing their nuclear arsenals. Cut card there. Nuclear war leads to extinction. All right. They told me to go slower, and I just didn't think of it. Okay. Go ahead. You ready for cross?
Let me restart that. Yeah. Are you good?
Yeah.
All right. Starting now. Okay. So in the world post-plan, the United States will still possess nuclear weapons. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So how does that interact with your first evidence with the form of nuclear hostility? Where do you read specifically that the nuclear hostility is dependent upon the concept of the potential for a first strike from the U.S.?
I'm not sure what your question is. Could you simplify it?
Okay. So your first evidence and your inherency indicates that we're on this brink of nuclear hostility, and it's the highest it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where in any of your solvency evidence do you read particularly that nuclear hostility is driven specifically, in your inherency or in your solvency claiming to solve for your inherency?
Okay.
Are you reading anywhere that it claims that nuclear hostility is particularly dependent on the potential threat of a first nuke strike from the U.S.?
I think that's the whole implied threat behind the brinkmanship. No, listen, just because we are saying no first use will be the solution doesn't mean the absence of it is what's causing the problem.
Do you have to when it comes to your let's talk about your attack scenario, the first one on Russia. So we don't have a no first use policy right now, right?
Correct.
And fortunately, Putin has threatened it, but he hasn't used any nuclear weapons. How did no first use change status quo deterrence of Russian nuclear aggression?
Sorry, say that again?
How is no first use an improvement over status quo deterrence specifically related to your Russia scenario?
Because the whole point is that we have a brinkmanship scenario set up. The idea behind brinkmanship is kind of like how it was in the arms race. If you think Cold War, there's kind of a parlaying of threat that exists. Putin right now is in a particularly damning position politically, and we absolutely need the establishment of a no first use policy to walk him down from the position that he's in right now, especially considering the context of how our allies feel about it.
Okay. Do you have any evidence specifically relating that this would disambiguate any concerns with allies? Like basically, how do we ensure that allies are going to trust that the U.S. actually has a no first use perspective?
Well, you could ask that of any IR question. The answer. Do you want me to answer it really quickly? Okay. Gonna take prep?
Yeah. Shoot, I also apologize. I think I did that one or the cross-section. Apologies to the votes.
All right. Order's going to be 3 off and then on.
For those of you that are new to flowing, you'll want to have 3 pages of paper for each position that Justin reads, and he'll be very clear about when you're moving to a new piece of paper.
Yeah, I'll be sure to signpost that. Yeah, typically you'll want one additional sheet per argument, so you'll want 3.
No, he said 3 off, which means you want 3 sheets. So 1 sheet per off position. And then whatever you flowed my case on will come after that.
Yep.
So if you have, I see some looks of confusion out there. Whatever you flowed my speech on, okay, put that behind 3 new pieces of paper.
Did you get the 1 and C on the drop?
Yeah, 1 second.
Cool. All right.
And hopefully I...
Everybody ready? Shay, you good?
Yeah, let's give them, so I see some
Okay,
confusion.
still a few more
Let's give them
minutes.
some time. I'm ready when you are.
All right. 7-minute speech starting now. First off is going to be the topicality procedural. A is the interpretation. The affirmative must reduce the number of nuclear weapons by more than 1,875 to be substantial. First is that a substantial reduction is 50% or more, and judges agree. This is Davon versus Clemmy 1. The absence of detailed contemporaneous time records will call for a substantial reduction in any award. What is a substantial reduction? 50% is a favorite among judges. And 2, U.S. total nukes are 3,750. Half of that is 1,875. This is Kristen in quarter 21. According to new data, the United States possessed a total of 3,750 nuclear warheads in the Department of Defense nuclear weapons stockpile as of September 2020. That number is only 50 warheads less than our estimate of 3,800 warheads from early this year. The 3,750 warhead number is only 72 warheads fewer than in September 2017, the last number made available before the Trump administration closed the books. That reduction is by any measure mediocre. And B is the violation. The AF plan does not call for a reduction of 1,875 or more nuclear weapons. This is not a substantial reduction. C are the standards. 1 is predictable neg ground. Our interp is best for predictable ground because it's based on the grammatical interpretation of all the words in the resolution. Our interp allows for a debate round around the number of nuclear weapons being reduced, which is key to DA and link arguments. Second is limits. Our interp is best for limits. A reduction of 50% or more allows for a predictable debate and limits the AF from exploding the research burden on the negative. D are the voters. 1, the rules of NFA-LD. You are required by the rules of NFA-LD to vote negative if we win and they are not topical. Failure to vote on this page destroys fairness in education. And 2, topicality is a procedural issue, meaning that they're violating our interpretation means we lose access to a fair debate and the in-depth discussion necessary for robust topical education. The only resolution to procedural is to vote neg. And 3, prefer competing interpretations to reasonability in this instance because there is no clear way to provide or determine what a reasonable interp is. You should assume that failure to meet our standards means that their interpretation is unreasonable by default. Second is the disadvantage. First is the uniqueness. U.S. nuclear deterrence is key to international stability stability across multiple fronts in SQUO. China, Russia, and North Korea are increasing nuclear risk. Schlepper 23. Russian invasion of Ukraine has taken place in the shadow of Russia's nuclear weapons. Thinly veiled nuclear threats by Putin have highlighted states' reliance on nuclear deterrence. In the case of NATO and its allies, in parallel, China's nuclear expansion and provocative activities in the Asia-Pacific are of great concern to U.S. allies. North Korea has a growing nuclear stockpile that serves as a stark reminder of the necessity of strengthening deterrence through the United States. Allies in Europe and Asia are paying close attention to how the United States deters both Russia and China, addresses the threat posed by an increasingly capable nuclear North Korea, and provides assurances to allies. Next is the link. A no first use policy risks U.S. extended deterrence measures, placing U.S. forces and allies in the crosshairs of non-nuclear strikes while increasing proliferation concerns. Harvey 19. The main concern in adopting a policy of no first use is that it can lead an enemy to believe that it could launch a catastrophic non-nuclear strike against the United States, its allies, or U.S. overseas forces without fear of nuclear reprisal. A centerpiece of America's efforts to produce a more peaceful world and extending the full range of U.S. military power. It has been U.S. policy for decades that deterrence is strengthened when an adversary is unsure of the precise conditions under which the United States would employ nuclear weapons. If the United States were to adopt a policy of no first use, it would prevent clear risks for deterrence for the regional security more broadly and to the non-proliferation regime, while the supposed benefits of such a policy could offset risks that are largely illusory. And internal link, U.S. deterrence key to preventing cyber threats, 923. American officials acknowledge that U.S. offensive cyber operations have stopped Russian disruption of the 2018 congressional election. There are 4 major mechanisms to reduce and prevent adverse behavior in cyberspace: threat of punishment, denial by defense, entanglement, and normative taboos. Because deterrence rests on perceptions, its effectiveness depends on answers not just to the question of how, but also the questions of who and what. American policymakers have made it clear that deterrence is not limited to the cyber realm. The United States will respond to cyber attacks across domains or sectors with any weapons of its choice proportional to the damage that has been done. That can range from naming and shaming to economic sanctions to kinetic weapons. And the impact. Cyber attacks can cause damage worse than nuclear weapons. We turn and outweigh the Straub 19. A cyber attack with widespread impact and intrusion in one area that spreads to others, or a combination of lots of smaller attacks, could cause significant damage, including mass injury and death, rivaling the death toll of a nuclear weapon. Unlike a nuclear weapon, which would vaporize people within 100 feet and kill almost everyone within a half mile, the death toll for most cyber attacks would be slower. People might die from a lack of food, power, or gas or heat, or from car crashes resulting from a corrupted traffic light system. This could happen over a wide area, resulting in mass injury and even deaths. Thus, the counterplan. The United States federal government should reduce the role of its nuclear weapons by declaring the sole purpose for U.S. nuclear weapons as deterring nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and partners. Next is the solvency. The counterplan solves the aft. Sole purpose de-emphasizes the role of nuclear weapons. Panda Narang 21. A sole purpose declaration can be constructed to de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons in American security strategy. It is appropriate crafted sole purpose declaration could help to realize the president's stated vision on nuclear weapons. And the counterplan solves the disad. Sole purpose maintains the credibility of the nuclear arsenal, ensuring that nuclear deterrence still provides a disincentive from cyber attacks. And on the inherency, Turn and their Hirsch 23 evidence, the ununderlined portion of the card reads that basically, actually, skip that piece of evidence. Apologies. Let's go to the solvency level. No solvency. No first use policies don't provide the benefits they promised and aren't believed by adversaries. Test cases prove this is Koslow 21. A no first use policy end goal is restricting the scenarios in which the United States could threaten to employ nuclear weapons. Advocates of nuclear no first use policies articulate benefits. We examined 4 cases where states adopted a no first use policy to see if they benefited in expected ways. In each of the cases, the benefits were entirely absent. Cut the card there. Next is going to be analysis on the advantage. So first is that the disad particularly turns. Brinkmanship fails in a world in which we already have nuclear deterrence, which means the disad is a direct turn to the case advantage and solves for both of the nuclear scenarios in the 1AC, meaning that any risk of the disad is going to be enough to turn and outweigh the aff, and a reason why you should always prefer the counterplan compared to the affirmative. And NFU has zero credibility. The policy doesn't require a change in force posture, and even if it did, it's still not believed. China and Russia won't change behavior. Chambers 21. The U.S. adoption of NFU policy would not require any modification of U.S. nuclear force posture or force requirements. Credibility is a perception formed in the mind of the adversary. The main nuclear armed competitors of the United States are shift to USU. Okay, I guess cut the card there.
Sorry, cut card where?
That would have been a We'll cut it right after a perception formed in the mind of an adversary. That was probably the last like intelligible thing I said.
Which card?
That's the Chambers, Mill, and Hutton Williams 21 evidence.
Okay.
No internal link. Sorry, I ran out of some time on the case stuff. So you can delete if it makes it easier on you. You can delete the where I try to reread the Hirsch evidence. You can keep the Koslau card, and you can delete where I was going to kind of both of the pieces of Hirsch evidence I was going to try to get you on. So you can delete both of those. And then I didn't read the second Chambers card, Chambers, William, Hutton, etc.
Can you upload a new doc?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hard when you can't go fast.
I know we both are a little rusty.
Yeah. Me more so than you. All right. So I just popped that in there. It's just another named as the one in C again, but with a later timestamp. So
Get a chance to pull it up and then.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Are you ready for cross-X?
Yep.
Okay, is this
Yep.
going?
There we go.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So for topicality, I'm sorry, could you remind me of the resolution?
Yeah, I think it was behind the board. United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons.
Okay, and if you could, in brief words, tell me what the violation is on the topicality.
Yeah, so the violation is you don't reduce the amount of nuclear weapons. My argument is specifically that we need to interpret all of the words in the resolution,
Okay,
not just
awesome.
pick some.
Thank you. Let's talk about the disadvantage. So you say nuclear deterrence is key across multiple fronts, right?
Yes.
How is having a no first use policy no longer deterrence? We still have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, you can refer to my Harvey 19 evidence specifically is that like deterrence is uniquely predicated on the sense that the US could launch a first strike in the event of saber rattling. It's that particular perception is key to our deterrence being effective, and the affirmative reverses that, destroying any credibility of our deterrence.
Okay, so you're saying having the ability to say, we could get you is enough to deter.
It's both that, but it's also the strategic ambiguity. My
Okay.
again, my at the bottom of my Harvey 19 evidence, it specifically talks about that strategic ambiguity is what is key in fact. So it's not just necessarily like we can get you; it's that you don't know how we're going to get you.
Okay, so the surprise factor, right?
Mhm.
Later on my advantage, you say brinkmanship fails. So how is what you're saying now that brinkmanship is a cool thing because it puts surprise in? How does that interact with the argument that you say later?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's the fact that the U.S. deterrence strategy prevents us from getting to any sort of brink, right?
And
My
what is
argument.
the current deterrence strategy.
So the current deterrence strategy is
ambiguous,
it's the
right?
form of strategic ambiguity. You are going to assert that it's bad. I have evidence, probably more compelling evidence, indicating that strategic ambiguity is a very good thing.
Okay, so then your counter plan is what you're advocating for, yes?
Yes. Mhm.
Are you going for this conditionally, unconditionally?
I guess I'm going to go for this unconditionally. I don't want to listen to theory.
So the sole purpose strategy. What is a sole purpose strategy that you say the U.S. should go for?
Yeah, the sole purpose is that the U.S. Nuclear weapon, specifically declaring that the sole purpose is for deterring nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and our partners.
And that is or that is not ambiguous?
That is somewhat ambiguous because it doesn't say exactly how we are going to deter that, which could.
What problem is it solving?
It's solving that in the world of the affirmative, the no first use policy clearly eliminates one of the components of nuclear deterrence. I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take prep. Okay. Yeah. I keep trying to press save and I accidentally press control save. Okay. Downloads. Okay. Okay, it's up. The order is going to be T, counterplan, disadd, disadd, counterplan, and case in order. Is everybody ready? We're so close. All right. On topicality, first, I'd like you to actually drop down all the way to the standard debate where he says on grammar, he takes into account for all of the words in the resolution. But let's go back up to the interpretation. The resolution says the United States federal government should substantially reduce the number and or role of its nuclear weapons. We meet the role portion. There's no first use pledge and a reduction in the role of nuclear weapons. This is by Harvey in 2019. The U.S. no first use pledge is a way to signal to the world a reduced role for nuclear weapons. This means at the T level, the interpretation that he reads on the number of nuclear weapons is absolutely irrelevant here in a world where the resolution gives me access to debate the role if I choose to, and/or means I do not have to also debate about the number or reduce the number. There shouldn't be a question here on whether or not he wins on topicality, because at the end of the day, I meet the whole resolution, and the interpretation provided by the negative has nothing to do with the role, which is provided as an opportunity. It means you do not vote on topicality, and it should become a non-issue for you. Let's go to the disadvantage. The crux of the disadvantage is one that puts the negative in a difficult position, because on case they say that brinkmanship fails, but also at the same time tries to establish a brink on the disadvantage by saying that there are several risks that exist in the status quo. Yes, this is exactly the point of what the affirmative is trying to make. There are risks in the status quo, and they exist because of a lack of a no first use policy. On the link level, they say that no first use actually risks us allies, and this is by Harvey in 2019. But if you look at our evidence by Graham in 21, which post dates the Harvey in 19 evidence, it is a better analysis on why the status quo is actually better suited for a no first use policy right now. Sure, in a world 4 years ago, maybe no first use would not have worked, but now it is ripe to work. At the impact level, I also want you to cross-apply the Weiss 23 evidence. That's our solvency evidence that says that not only are there all the issues that no first use solves, but Not having no first use as a policy works zero sum with the issues that the world's global leaders are focusing on, which knocks global warming down as a priority. And all of the issues with global warming actually just act as an impact magnifier for the affirmative. Not only that, the affirmative solves deterrence commitments. Conventional deterrence is more credible and doesn't carry the cost of nuclear ambiguity. Tannenwald, 2019. Skeptics believe that an NFU promise would be costly for the United States given its extended deterrence commitments. A policy of calculated ambiguity is unnecessary. The U.S. conventional capabilities are sufficient to deter the response. None of the United States adversaries can defeat the United States in a non-nuclear conflict. The threat to use nuclear weapons first against non-nuclear states has a coercive power. The cost of starting a nuclear war would vastly outweigh the benefits. Constantly arguing the nuclear weapons are necessary reduces the credibility of the United States' more usable conventional deterrent. And go to the counterplan. First of all, PERM do both. The U.S. could technically declare both things. The PERM is a test of competition on whether or not it would be the case. And this is less confusing than the status quo, which the affirmative or which the negative says that that's actually a benefit, but then also says that it doesn't really make sense. Sole purpose is terribly vague, so much so that it actually doesn't have the solvency potential that the affirmative has. And the reason you're using it in the counterplan so as not to rock the boat, it basically also means that it's a non-statement, which means that it does not solve for the scenarios that the affirmative needs to solve for. And scenario 2, the second scenario, does not get solved for at all by the sole purpose counterplan. This goes absolutely dropped by the negative. And the whole point of the sole purpose nuclear deterrence issue is what makes allies more comfortable. But that becomes increasingly a complex statement in the world where the affirmative is winning on the uniqueness on what is acceptable right now and what is actually needed right now. On solvency, go to case. They say that we don't solve, and they use Cost-Lau 21 evidence because it doesn't work. But look at the evidence that they point to. They say they look at 4 cases and that they didn't see a benefit. But this warranting is not very good. It just says there was no benefit to be seen. But this is not an in-depth analysis at what benefit there is even to be had. The fact that there hasn't been nuclear war since any of these things have happened probably means we've seen the benefit we've been meaning to see. But not only that, the Weiss 23 evidence outweighs this, which means you're going to prefer, it outdates this, and it's just better warranted, which means you're going to prefer that on the solvency level. On advantage, they make this argument about how brinkmanship fails, but this is just a bad argument. One, because this is exactly the argument that we're trying to say for the uniqueness. Brinkmanship is currently at a state where it's not going to work anymore, which is why we need the no first use policy. All of my evidence gives warrants to explain why no first use would solve. And they say no China war, but war with China over Taiwan really does risk nuclear escalation. The risk is greater than the Ukraine situation, and there are no checks, which means that there's miscalculation likely on the horizon. And cross-apply scenario 2 entirely goes untouched. All right, how much time do you have left? Okay. Hey, Jonathan, can you do me a favor? Can you check what's going in with the coaches? I'm assuming because this is running late, debates aren't going to start quite yet, but could you let me know? Thanks. What's happening is they're thinking that other rounds are going to happen, but we're going to hear back on if rounds are even happening between now and then, because they kind of need us to judge. So I don't know where they think they're going. This is 1003.
I was going to say, my round can start absolutely. So 1005.
Yeah. Julian, can you check in on that? Thanks.
You guys are just starting with one.
This is the NR. So there's about 9 minutes left to the debate. Yeah. You have 30 seconds left.
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Order's going to be disad, counterplan, case.
All right, so let's set it up. Let's go.
Okay. Well, good thing I'm out of prep now.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
All right. This is another 6-minute one.
6 minutes, yeah.
Cool. All right, let's start on the disad first. Okay, let's resolve this question about brinkmanship versus status quo deterrence. My argument is specifically coming out of the Scheppers 23 evidence that our existing nuclear deterrence scenarios have avoided any true brinkmanship scenarios. That is what the argument against the AF is. It is not necessarily, this is not me double speaking. This is an instance of where I think my opponent doesn't necessarily fully recognize the warrants in the Scheppers 23 evidence. It specifically indicates the state's reliance on nuclear deterrence in these various cases of scenarios that have the potential to escalate to a true brinkmanship scenario. This is going to come down to whether or not you buy that there is a difference between an active brinkmanship scenario and passive deterrence that is key to actually supporting U.S. interests around the globe. That nuance of that analysis is key and was something that was entirely missed by my opponent. I mean, you're going to flow across sort of this uniqueness scenario solely in the realm of the AF that we have avoided active brinkmanship scenarios, and for an example, an active brinkmanship scenario would be something like the Cold War when missiles were actually on alert and continued to be launched. Putin making some random threats, but not actually activating any of Russia's missiles do not qualify for that. So this disad, you're going to still go ahead and pull it through. You're going to want to go ahead and extend. So that was kind of their first argument on here. The next argument is that that this brinkmanship exists because of a lack of deterrence, but specifically you can cross-apply by analysis on the first argument that says that we're avoiding the concept of brinkmanship actually occurring. Next, my opponent attempts to compare the Graham 21 evidence to my Harvey 19 evidence, but you're going to be preferring the analysis in the Harvey 19 evidence specifically because it indicts the concept of a no first use policy in the context of reducing the fear of nuclear reprisal. So this is kind of the crux of the strategic ambiguity argument, right? Because my Harvey evidence specifically indicates that deterrence is strengthened when an adversary is unsure of the precise conditions under which the United States would employ nuclear weapons. Make sure you remember this because this is going to be key to the solvency of the counterplan as well. It's the sense that that they may not know. It's not a question of necessarily if we will deter, it's a question of how. And that's going to be key to both the link on the disad and the solvency of the counterplan. But furthermore, my opponent completely negates any defense on my impact scenario. You're going to extend my NI 23 evidence, which again is more recent than any evidence presented on this. Like the conventional deterrence argument wasn't really warranted out well. So you can just extend this across, specifically indicating how deterrence up until the point of nuclear weapons specifically avoids cyber attacks, and cyber attacks are a greater threat than nuclear weapons. So you can also turn that, because cyber threats due to the slow portion of that is also going to be a worse impact than the nuclear weapon scenarios of the 1AC. And even though they claim to do they try to claim like an impact magnification, you could also cross apply this in the same way, given that we specifically talk about how cyber attacks create more of a risk of additional nuclear attacks, which additionally creates even less of a focus on global warming, because then we would be dealing with nuclear winter and everything. Making global warming worse means that the disadvantage is actually a better scenario for global warming. But let's go to the counterplan. First, let's talk about the perm and why it fails. First is that, the affirmative specifically declares a policy of how the United States will respond. Specifically says we will not strike you first. And that's the problem. The counter plan says we might, but we're not going to be the act, like we're not going to do it for no reason. If the United States feels that, Russia or China or some of these other places have established a credible nuclear threat, and there is missiles activated, if it does get to that brinkmanship scenario, that then the United States could strike them and deter that, right? It's the question of nuclear deterrence is both how and why, right? And so the counter plan is key to circumventing the issues with the how in the world of the affirmative. That means that and further means that we were able to solve back for the disad, which is going to turn and outweigh the af. The solvency argument specifically on the Panda and Narang evidence, just like this analysis doesn't really, my opponent doesn't really engage with the Panda and Narang evidence. Here, especially with, the solvency argument, just kind of says it doesn't solve for the scenario and says it doesn't solve for the second scenario. But, my argumentation about the general solvency of the failure of no first use and why the sole purpose declaration can solve it in that Panda and Narang evidence can be extended across. Let's talk about case. So on case here, a couple of scenarios. First is that she tries to indict the Weiss evidence, but you can cross apply that with the Chambers, Malign, Hunt, and William evidence. And specifically, the credibility is formed in the mind of the adversary, and that the shift to NFU is unlikely to be viewed as credible and would not cause Russia and China to favorably alter their behavior. This warrant goes cold conceded, which means we turn any war scenario, because we control the internal link, to deterrence, which is going to control any nuclear war scenario when they concede this internal link. That means that the disad is the only risk of any sort of link into a war scenario. The counterplan is the only chance of solving for the disad, which means you can either vote on the counterplan solving the disad or the disad just straight turning the af and winning this debate for the neg.
No prep time. Cool. That's fine, I guess. I did. Okay, let me just make sure I am in a good place. 3 minutes on the clock. Okay, it's going to go an overview, disadvantage, actually an overview, counterplan, disadvantage, case. Yeah. Everybody ready? This round comes down to a couple of things at the end of the day. It's a question of what no first use does versus what sole purpose does versus what the status quo does. We're not worried about the status quo right now because my opponent is going for sole purpose, which means that you're evaluating no first use against the counter plan. Let's talk about the counter plan. The permutation, they answer that they say that there's no reason why the counter plan doesn't solve this now and why a permutation doesn't make sense, why we can't do both at the same time. Sure, I'll concede that maybe it doesn't make sense for both to not happen at the same time because it wouldn't make sense. What makes it not make sense is because sole purpose is extremely ambiguous and doesn't make sense in the grand scheme of things. They say that I don't answer some of the solvency arguments on the counter plan, but one, there's still no answer as to how the counter plan solves scenario 2. They just say that I ignored the solvency evidence, but doesn't give a warrant for that. But 2, this straight up does not answer any of the arguments for why no first use is a solid policy. Not only does my Weiss evidence say this, and I cross apply it, but the Tannewald 19 evidence says this, and we're going to use that on the disadvantage, but Tannewald specifically explains why no first use actually works, especially in a world where so far there is a brinkmanship scenario that's been built up. On the disadvantage, They say on the uniqueness, it doesn't make sense because there is no brinkmanship scenario right now, but it's almost like Justin wasn't listening for the first minute of my 1AC because the Hirsch 23 evidence literally talks about how we are in a situation as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis right now, which means you're just preferring the affirmative on uniqueness. And context matters. They say that their Harvey 19 evidence indicts the concept of NFUs, but not only have I read you several pieces of arguments on why NFUs work, but also they don't answer that Graham explains it in the context of the now, not the 4 years ago. And they don't answer how the impact magnifier works in favor of the affirmative because it is not something that the counter plan solves. Only the affirmative solves it. On the advantage, they make answers as how the disadvantage turns a lot of things on the advantage and on case. But in a world where they're literally dropping the Tannenwald evidence, which is the damning evidence on disadvantage that goes absolutely unanswered, which absolutely turns it in the affirmative's favor, it means that none of the answers on case make any sense. Look, at the end of the day, the status quo and the counter plan are really confusing about what our allies need to listen to and what gets deterred. A no first use policy is clear, and all of the evidence tells you why it solves.
Been too long.
Been too long.
Good job, guys.
Okay, let's end this. Do I end live streaming just by pressing end stream?